Hi there. Welcome back to Tuesday's Tips. I'm Greg Kaiser, and in this weekly feature we've been delving into Lightroom specifically, but image editors in general, and talking about the different features that you can do and kind of give you an idea of what is possible. Like I said, we deal with Lightroom specifically, and we're going to be looking at the Detail tab today, which includes things like sharpening and noise reduction. Noise reduction has gotten a lot of interest here lately with all the AI noise reduction, and Lightroom has that. We're actually not going to talk about that today, though. That's pretty much a one-button click, and the computer kind of figures out everything and goes from there. But I've always been a fan of doing it yourself and knowing why you're doing what you're doing. So we're going to look at doing this manually, and for my workflow and my purposes, I much prefer that, but we'll get into a lot more detail of that here shortly. Just know that anytime you do noise reduction in an image, you are actually softening the image overall. So whether it's AI, whether it's manual, you are going to be softening your image and losing some of that edge sharpness. And edge sharpness is just simply another version of contrast. And we've talked about contrast in these videos quite a bit, from the contrast slider to the tone curve to how to manipulate the highlights and the shadows and the blacks and the whites. So we're getting into just another version of contrast. Kind of like clarity, dehaze, and texture. We're looking at a specific kind of contrast, and this is dealing with edges. So we're going to go ahead and jump into Lightroom, and I'm going to go ahead and get my screen shared. Remember which keys to get you here. And we're going to start, and we're looking at a total of 3 images today, 3 very different images, and I've chosen them for different reasons. This first one is kind of a general type image that you're going to have as a landscape type photographer, and I imagine if you're on this channel that's kind of your main focus. So we've got this image of the Mabry Mill in Virginia, right along the Blue Ridge Parkway. Probably one of the most photographed spots on the parkway. This is one of my more recent pictures of it. Not claiming that it's anything special or different from what anybody else has captured, but I do like it, and it's part of my collection, and I'm proud of it, but that's beside the point. I've done the edit on this, and we've gone through, we've done the stuff in the basic tab, calibration, color mixer, tone curve. Anytime you see these eyeballs highlighted, I've done something in these tabs. I have not done anything with color grading, and as of right now, I have not done anything in the detail tab. So I have these set up in the order that I will typically work an image. And detail comes here, and there's a lot of people that say you need to do sharpening, noise reduction, things like that before you start an edit. My idea is I like to work sharpening and noise reduction after I have done some of the initial edits, because that can bring noise into an image. If we look up here in the basic tab, I've brought the highlights down, which is not going to cause a big problem, but I've boosted the shadows quite a bit. That's going to add noise potentially. Now if we look up here under the histogram, these are the settings that I shot this image at. ISO 100, 50 millimeters at f16 for a good depth of field, and it was at a half second. The ISO 100 is the important part here. That's a very clean setting. I'm shooting this on a Canon 5 DSR. It's got fantastic low ISO performance as far as noise reduction, so I don't expect to see a lot of noise. But with the things that I have changed, I do see that there is the possibility that some noise can get introduced. So I always hit this tab after the basic edit, after the global edit. And what I'll do first and foremost is I'm going to go into an area that has dark qualities to it that is reasonably close to where I set the focus. So the focus was set, if I'm not mistaken, right around in here when I shot this. So I'm going to zoom in, and we've got the water wheel here, and we've got these sharp areas. So I know that everything in through here is going to be in that plane of focus, and I'm not looking at the extended depth of field. This is where I focused. So a couple of things jump out at me here. Number one, and it may be hard to see on your end depending on what you're viewing this on, but there's a little bit of noise that has started to pop out here on this water wheel. And it is just very, very subtle, and it's kind of this grainy look. Like I said, shot at ISO 100, I don't expect there to be a lot of noise, but there is just a little bit of graininess here where it should be smooth. So I'm going to come down here to manual noise reduction. I don't need to go through AI denoise and all that stuff, because as you see here, it reduces the noise with artificial intelligence. I prefer my version of AI, actual intelligence. That's debatable. But the result will be saved as a new DNG file. That now gives me 2 files to work with. And in my workflow, if I'm doing denoise at this point, I've got a file that has edits to it, and then I've got a DNG that is going to be based on this AI noise reduction. That's 2 files to keep up with. I don't want to do that. I like simplicity of having just a single file. So I have yet to use the AI denoise. Not saying that I won't, but I prefer doing this manually, and it's actually very simple. So we come down here, there's 2 different variations of noise reduction. There's a luminance noise reduction and a color noise reduction. Color noise reduction is when you start seeing the different red and green pixels that are kind of all splattered around. It's not hot pixels, don't get them confused, but you'll actually see that there are color qualities to the areas of noise, the grain, if you'd like to say it that way. There is nothing here color-wise, so I don't have to worry about that. I've got another example for color here shortly. But this, we're just dealing with luminosity noise, and that's that first slider. And as you see, it's defaulted at 0. So I'm just going to take my slider, and I'm watching up here where I see the noise in the wheel. And I'll tell you what, to make it a little bit easier on you, we're going to go into 200%. So you see, it just, in my opinion, that needs to be smoothed out. And a lot of that is from the edit that I have done thus far. So that's my fault, not the camera's fault. But you take this slider and you start moving it to the right. And you just kind of look and see when it smooths to what you want to see. And that's about right for me. It's subtle, but if we go up here and we hit the eyeball next to detail, you can see where we have smoothed that just a little bit. And to me, that's fine. I know in print, that's not going to show. I didn't do much in terms of noise reduction at only 12 points here. So I don't really worry about adding detail back. That's if you're putting in a lot of noise reduction and you start to really soften the edges. Like I mentioned, anytime you do noise reduction, you are softening the image. But we've also not done any sharpening on it yet. I don't need to add detail back because I know I'm going to be adding sharpening to it. The contrast slider, we'll talk about that later. Again, there's nothing down here in color I need to worry about. So we're going to go back to 100%, and we know that this is the area where I focused. So I'm going to find good crisp edges to look at, and that's going to be down here in this grass. Now we're coming up to sharpening. We've taken care of the little bit of noise that's there, so we're in good shape. And with the sharpening, we take this slider, and it defaults at 40, which I found to be a very good starting point on sharpening, and generally I keep at a minimum of 40 on my images. But I do add, especially in landscape stuff and decay, I will add a lot of sharpening in because I do like those crisp edges. So just like the other one, we start up here at the amount slider and we move to the right. And it takes a little while to know what you're looking at, but you find areas of contrast, you find those edges, and you start seeing when, if you go overboard, You see how this becomes really, really crunchy really quick. You see all the blades of grass, all of this is just too much. We also add this weird kind of modeling noise right here. You'll see how it looks like a camouflage pattern almost. That's too much. So we dial that back, and what we want to do is just get to the point where we see that division between sharp and then getting too much. And that's going to be somewhere in here. And I know with my combination of camera, again the Canon 5DSR, and this was shot on the 2470 f2.8 version 2, I know that the sharpening that I can get out of that is somewhere between 65 and 80 on the upper range. Beyond that gets too sharp for my taste. But this is, again, you season to taste. But at this point, we've got a good baseline at 71. The grass looks good to me. It's sharp. It's not overly sharp. The radius will tell you how far off of these edges that the effect is done. Now we can go over here and we can kind of make that a large radius, and I think that actually blurs a lot of this fine detail. So what I will do typically is I will leave it at 1.0, or I will drop this down, especially when I'm looking at fine detail like landscapes, to about a 0.6 or even all the way to the left. And it's hard to see, so you can hit the Alt key option on the Mac, and you can kind of go through here and see. And you see as you go way over here to the right how crunchy everything starts to get. As we come back over here, we soften that effect. So I'm adding a lot of sharpening, but I'm dialing back that effect. Like I said, about 0.06 or 0.6 was where I liked it. And we're just getting those predominant edge areas. And that's what I'm wanting to sharpen. Same thing with the detail. And I like to add detail, which makes it a little bit sharper and just brings in those edges a little bit more. And if you have a hard time seeing that, Alt or Option on the Mac, and again it brings up this contrast view, and you can kind of see just where those details are. So something about right there looks good to me. I can see the individual blades of grass, I can see the texture in the wood. The soft area of the wheel, I'm not seeing any real sharpening going. So I've now added the sharpening, I've decreased the radius to make it a little less intense, and then I've added detail in, so I have established where these blades of grass are. You can go back and forth on this little eyeball, and you can see how that has affected this image. But what happens is, when we do all of this, we go up here to these dark areas, these smooth areas like this water wheel. There are no edges to bring detail to, but we have increased sharpening in this area, which essentially has introduced noise. Now we've taken noise out, and I could go over here and I could dial in more noise reduction, but again that's going to overly sharpen the image. So then I'll have to add more sharpening, which then I'll have to add more noise reduction, and by the time it's all said and done, I've got this weird ghost-like image. So Lightroom has this really nice masking feature, and masking is just what it says. It is going to mask the area that is going to be sharpened. For this, I zoom out. I want to see the whole picture most of the time. There are some examples when I'm really dialing in the sharpening on like leaves in a tree. This isn't one of those images. But with this masking, I can move this left and right, and you can see a whole lot of difference, can't you? You sure can. Nope, it's not your TV. You can't really see anything at this point. This is where it defaults, but again, that Alt or Option button on your keyboard, press that, left click on the mouse, and it makes your picture go away. It doesn't actually go away, but just like in Photoshop, you see what is white, and what is masked is what is in black when you're talking about layers and layer masks. So everything that is white is getting the sharpening effect. As we drag this slider to the right, what is in black is not getting the effect. So you see, almost immediately, we're knocking that wheel out. So we're taking the sharpening effect out of the wheel, and we're sharpening everything else around. And what I like to do, because I do like to add a good bit of sharpening, is I like to take it out of the majority of the image. I am just interested in edge sharpening at this point. So up at about 68%, everything that's black is not getting sharpened. So the water, the wheel, smooth surfaces are not getting this effect. Everything in white is getting sharpened, and I can actually start seeing the structure in the scene. So right about in here, this looks about where I would have it at 72%. I can see the leaves in the tree. Everything I want sharpened is going to be sharpened. Now this mask only applies to the sharpening. The denoise that we did first applies to the whole image. There's not a mask for that. You can do denoise locally, and we'll talk about that later. But the sharpening has been reduced to just the edges. And if we zoom back in here on this water wheel, that area here that had that kind of overly sharpened look ever so slightly is now gone because we've masked it out. So we've got sharpening here on the grass. We have sharpening on the edges. We have reduced the noise in the dark areas. All of this has worked together to soften the noise, add sharpening back in, and then selectively put it where we want it. And if we toggle this effect on and off, zoomed in, that's without anything. See a little bit of noise. The grass is a little muddy. And now we've got really sharp grass, and there's no noise in this wheel. It is a subtle difference. And I will also add that all of this is based on screen resolution and how it looks best to the eyes. I recommend this type of sharpening for a baseline only with your image. When it comes time to print or do a different output, there's a different type of sharpening that's going to go in, and I actually do that through Smart Sharpen in Photoshop. That is a secondary sharpening that I will do on an image just so it is prepared for the final output. I do this for viewing on a screen, for sharing online, for doing that sort of thing, because this brings that sharpness that I need to see, because a print sharpening is over the top sharpening and it looks bad on a screen. That's when you know you've got the right amount of sharpening for print, is when it starts to degrade the image on the screen. At least that's how I look at it, and it's worked fantastically well over the years. So that is a general look at how I use this detail box, or the tab, as far as noise, as far as sharpening. Now, let's look at a noisy image, because I want to really get into showing how to work this denoise. Now, I do not do a lot of astrophotography, so don't hold me responsible for this picture. I know there are probably much better ways to do this. There's definitely much better equipment. Again, I'm on my 5DSR, which notoriously is terrible at high ISO ranges. It really is. I'll be the first to admit it. I don't shoot high ISO. And that's why I chose this picture for this demonstration, because it was shot at 6400. And for me, that is over the top. But I needed that to get the right shutter speed of 13 seconds to keep the stars from streaking in the sky at f2.8. Now there was a filter involved with this. It was Stingray's Astrovision filter, so it helped filter out some of the light intrusion down here from the city lights and made it a little bit more pleasing. It wasn't that yellow-orange, but there was a filter involved, 16 millimeters. So I've done all the basic editing on this at this point, and now we're looking at sharpening and noise reduction. Like I said, We want to do noise reduction first because that's going to deal with how much sharpening we're going to have to do later on. So we zoom in, and there is no question, you can see the noise. You can see the stars, but you can see the noise as well, and there's a lot of it. There is color noise here. There are little red, magenta-looking pixels in here, and just because of the color balance, we've lost kind of the green pixels or the green part of the noise, but there is definitely some color noise here. So what we want to do is with this slider, it starts at 25. I like to go up by 10 and just see where it starts to soften the image. So we're going to go 25 to 35. Okay, 35 still looks good. So we're going to go to 45. 45 starts to make things look muddy because it's taking color out of areas where I need color. So we're going to come back to 40. And we're getting the color back in. It still looks a little degraded to me. So we're going to split the difference between 35 and 40 because we know 35 is good, 40 is almost good, so we're going to do 38, 37. Okay, so at 37, we've still got the color that we need in the picture, but some of that noise is now gone. And it's hard to see, so we're going to go back and forth here. If we take the effect out, that's without the noise reduction. That's with it. It just smooths it a little bit. But we're now down to luminance noise. But if we needed to add some detail back on the color, we can do that and just move the slider back and forth and see. We can reduce the amount of detail or add to the amount of detail. And this is just more or less another version of edge sharpening. So somewhere right around in there looks good, and then we can adjust the smoothness, which is kind of that transition and just how jagged things look. So that's looking good right about there, and it's just seasoned to taste. So we're kind of set on the color noise at this point. So at this point we'll go up to the noise reduction on the luminance scale. And we'll just start dragging it across until we start to just kind of see the stars. And you see how this really is, this does the heavy lifting. But you want to do the color first so that all the color noise is taken out and it's down to just the digital noise, which is what this slider can take care of. So we know there's a lot of noise in here because this was the lousiest version of a camera to shoot astro with. But right about there, we're starting to smooth things out. It's looking good. And it's just starting to kind of soften the overall look of the image. I'm going to dial in a little bit more because I'm going to pull some detail back in with the detail slider. And this is not sharpening. This is just kind of refining how the edges work. We're just going to dial in a little bit of detail. And contrast is where the light and dark areas kind of come into play. And we can add contrast back in, and you see how that just, it brings a little detail into the sky, especially into this area. If we dial that out, you see how it's kind of smooth right here. We can bring that little bit of, it's almost like clarity, back into the image. So this is the manual noise reduction. That's what we started with. That's where we're at now. And that is just noise reduction done manually through Lightroom on something that is at 6400 ISO, which is incredibly high on this particular camera. New mirrorless cameras, this is nothing. You wouldn't have to go through hardly any of this to get a smoother image. But it works really well to demonstrate what I'm talking about as far as what can be done manually in noise reduction. Now that we're reasonably happy with the noise, we can start to look at edge sharpness, and we find a good solid edge. Again, f2.8 is not going to give us the best sharpness, but this gives us a starting point. So we're going to go over here to sharpening, and remember, as we add sharpening, we're adding noise back. So we want to be kind of careful, but we just kind of look at how things are going, and right about there is where it starts to bring back too much noise. Now we can play with the radius and hit that Alt or Option key, and you can kind of see where that division is. So in this situation, 1.8 seems to work pretty good. Detail, same thing. But we don't want to add detail to the noise that is in the sky. So we're going to dial the detail back a little bit. Again, we're at 100%. And I was just focused on infinity, but we can see that the stars are sharp. But we've added this sharpening into smooth areas. So we're going to zoom out, and we're going to go to masking. We're going to hit the Alt key. Everything that's white is getting sharpened. I want to change that. So I'm going to start dialing in this mask, and I just want to get the edges. I want to get the stars. I want to get the Milky Way. So something about there is going to take out all the unnecessary sharpening, which is adding unnecessary noise, and there we go. So looking at this image overall, because if you start getting into pixel peeping on a very noisy image, you're going to be disappointed. This is going to be more representative of how it's going to print and how it's going to be viewed. So we're looking at just the detail tab. I'm going to take this eyeball and we're going to go without the effect. That's where we were. As you see, the sky is very grainy. It's a very noisy image, but it's not bad looking at it from a distance. It gets bad when you look at it detail at 100%. But if we remove the noise, add that sharpening back in, you see the difference that we're making. It is really night and day, or in this case, night and nighter. But you can see the difference here. And again, I can't stress, this was a extremely, extremely high ISO range for this camera. And I knew that that was going to be the case, and that's one reason I don't do a lot of astro, because until recently, I have not had a camera with the high ISO performance that I would want for doing something like this. The 5DSR is old technology. It's fantastic when there's enough light. It's fantastic in shadow, but shooting this type of stuff puts a lot of draw on a camera's capabilities. But it made for a great example of how we can work these things within this tab, and we can kind of figure out the best way of doing it. And there's no second image I have to keep up with. So that shows a lot of how to do noise reduction, both luminance and color. And remember, there's two different things. Color are the bits of grain that have color in them. Noise is just that grain that is all basically a gray or white. And it's just that digital noise. And you handle them both differently. And we just kind of sharpen and again mask what doesn't need to be sharpened, because sharpening adds noise where it doesn't need to be. So that's all we're going to talk about on that one. Now something completely different, and just to show a different type of noise reduction and sharpening, is going to be on a type of portraiture, people pictures as I like to call them. Again, this is kind of a secondary end for me in photography. I do most of my work landscape decay type stuff, but I have been getting into portraiture, and this is one that I really wanted to show for this for a couple of different reasons. Number one, it is a realistic ISO setting at 1600. This was done at dusk. There was off-camera flash involved, so the background is actually underexposed from what it actually was. And we have flash on our subject here. So the exposure was pretty good to begin with. 1600 just let me balance this background here, and I balance the flash with that. f6.3, 1/125th of a second. So this is also done on a Canon R5, so a newer mirrorless body, much better high ISO performance, as we can see. And what we're doing is we are going into the area that we know is sharp. So this is where we focused. I used eye autofocus. It nailed the focus right here on the eye, even in low light. Cannot stress the importance of that with the new mirrorless cameras. When it comes to shooting people on the fly and quickly, I love this feature, and that's why I got this camera for this purpose. But we see here kind of where the noise is coming in. 1600 is not bad at all, and as you can see in kind of the dark areas that are supposed to be sharp, like right here in the nostril, sorry for pointing the nostril out, but you can see just a little bit of noise. Now there is no color noise at all in here. There's just a little bit of grain that is stealing from the sharpness. See it a little bit in the hair. So again, we're going to look at noise reduction first. And we're going to take this slider. Since there is no color noise, I don't need to do anything here. Everything is wonderful as it sits default. So we're going to start dialing this over to the right until right about there. And the noise is gone. Now, at 16 points, there's no real need to go in and do a whole lot with detail and contrast because we have not softened the image overall enough to worry about that. But if we wanted to dial in some detail, we can. We hit Alt, that goes to kind of a black and white, which makes it easier to see the difference. And there's not a whole lot because we're not dialing in much effect for the detail to counteract. So we're just going to leave that where it was. Contrast the same thing. It's just that clarity, but it's in areas where that noise reduction has affected things. There isn't any. So dialing in a low noise reduction like this, 10, 15, even 20, generally you're not going to have to do anything with detail and contrast unless you're dealing with some really specific areas of detail. So I'm happy with the noise here, and again, hit this eyeball, and you see it's just ever so minor, but it got rid of that noise. It softened the image slightly, and that's why now we're going to look at sharpening. Now, generally, when I shoot portraits, people pictures, I leave the sharpening at 40. Nobody wants to be overly sharp. Let me repeat that. Nobody wants to be overly sharp. It shows too many imperfections. So the native sharpness with my cameras and lenses is sufficient for doing people pictures. If I do add noise reduction, and again, we were out using ambient light, I wasn't in a studio setting, so the ISO was higher than I would generally like to have it, but again, on this camera, not an issue. But I do want to bring a little bit of sharpening to counter that noise reduction that I've done. So we're going to take this slider, just like we did before, and we're looking at the eyelashes here, because that's where it's going to be the sharpest. We're looking at the hair, we're looking at just the general texture here. So we're dialing this up, and somewhere right there looks good. If we go too high, we start getting crunchy, and this is one of those things everybody says, oh, look how sharp this, that, and the other is. And that's great, that's wonderful, but see how much detail you get in the skin, and that detail we don't want to show on that level. So we're going to dial it back, and somewhere right about there is going to sufficiently counter what we've handled with noise reduction. Now again, you can play with the radius and you can see, and that actually right there at default shows where I want the sharpening to really apply. I don't want to get too in depth, and you see around the eyes, when you start going into, having that spread 2 pixels out, it's getting too much. Down here, like we did with the grass around the mill, there's not enough effect. So somewhere right around there is sufficient, and between 0.7 and 1 is not a whole lot of difference. I was happy to leave the radius here for this one. Detail, I was happy to leave where it is, but again, if you want to manipulate it, you can. We can add more detail, which again, people generally don't want to see that much detail in themselves. You can dial it back a little bit. And I would actually say somewhere right around there, let's see, right around there looks good. That way we're still keeping some skin smoothing going, and we're not adding too much. But remember, we're applying the sharpening to the entire image. So normally I would say zoom out, you guessed it, we're going to go to masking, Alt or Option, and we're going to find the edges that we want. But here, a lot of the detail and a lot of what I'm wanting sharpened is going to be in the face, because that's what I focused on. So I'm going to go back and zoom in, and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do Alt or Option, we're going to do the left click on the masking slider, and now we're going to dial this in to exactly where we want to see our edges. And that's what this masking does. Remember, what's white is being revealed, what's black is being hidden. So if it's being hidden, the effect is not going. So everything that's black is not getting sharpened. What is in white is getting sharpened. I don't want to sharpen much because this is a person, and I want to make sure to keep the skin flattering. So something about right there, I'm going to be able to get the eyelashes, I'm going to be able to get the hair that's in focus, I'm going to be able to get those edges that define the face. So a mask of 85, and there we are. And this is subtle, but with the sharpening and noise reduction, this is the before, and you see I've added sharpening, but I've actually softened the image overall, because when I've applied these things, there is a more flattering blur, and that's even with adding the sharpening. But remember, we softened the image with noise reduction, and then we just added sharpening back just to these edges. So that is another way that you can look at skin sharpening, and why I wanted to bring in a people picture to show how this can work kind of counterintuitively to soften an image while retaining sharpness. And it doesn't seem like that's the way that you would want to use this panel, but it is another method. And again, it's not with AI, it's with actual intelligence, and looking at it from a holistic point of view and what you want to achieve with your picture. In each one of these images, I've wanted to achieve something different. Here, I just wanted to clean up a little bit of extra noise based on that 1600 ISO, which is still nothing for that camera. I wanted to sharpen areas, but I still wanted to keep the skin flattering and soft. In the one that we started out with, which is more typical of what I tend to do, I wanted to remove the little bit of noise that I added from the edit while adding the sharpness to define the grass, to define the edges, to make this have a little bit more presence without going over the top. And in this one, I was having to deal with a limitation of my equipment with the high ISO performance, and 6400 is very, very high for that camera. But I was able to make it a workable image that it does actually print fine. I did a test print of this, and it prints wonderfully, considering that without this one panel, that's what we started with. So it smooths everything out, keeps everything nice and crisp where we want it. And that's the benefit of this detail tab, and it is just that. We are looking at the details of the image, how the edges are represented, what's sharp, what's not, where there's grain. Grain can be a good thing, and utilized in the correct way, we wouldn't want to do noise reduction. There's other situations where we do want to do noise reduction, and then we'll add grain later, but we'll do that tab at another time. But that pretty much wraps this up, and I think we've covered kind of how these different things work. And just as a review, the amount is how much sharpening you are applying. The radius is how far beyond that pixel edge it is being affected. And do that alter option, and you can see where those edges are in black and white. Detail, same thing. That tells you kind of how much contrast is being put in for that amount of sharpening. Alter option gives you the ability to see the edges. With masking, again, you're not going to be able to do this without the alter option, because that shows you in white what is being affected, in black what is not being affected. So we're not adding noise or any other additional sharpening to those areas in the black, only to what's in the white. Down here, noise reduction, if you want to do the AID noise, hit the button, follow the prompts, go for it. With manual noise reduction, which is what I prefer doing, there's two types. There's luminance noise, which is your basic grain, and then color noise, which is the grain that has color to it. And you can adjust these by sliders. These are the main amounts. And then you can fine-tune how that affects the image and bring back some sharpness, bring back some contrast by doing the detail and contrast sliders after you have done the first of the three. Most everything in Lightroom is set up to where you do it in order. This is no different. The difference is I like to do the detail work after a global edit before I do local adjustments, because as I do local adjustments, I can create more noise. I can create a need for more sharpness, but I can do both of those locally. So when I adjust something, for instance, locally here just on the mill itself, I can then add sharpness or denoise as needed just here, not dealing with everything else around. So local adjustments have their benefits, but I've done global adjustments up to this point. This is my baseline, and this is where I want to sharpen and denoise. So that pretty much brings us to the end of this one. I hope I didn't go overboard with it. I hope I didn't go too long. There is a lot to the detail tab, and if it's something that you want to work with in more detail, we can do this as an online mentorship, and we can work it on your images and how you edit and for what your expectations are and your output. I'll leave a link to my mentorship information in the comments or in the description. It's something we can do hourly. It's something we can do long-term, up to months, dealing with how we edit and going through these different modules and how you use it in your workflow. All I can do is show you how I do it in my workflow here and hope that it works for how you edit a picture. At least it should give you an idea of how things can be done. And that's the whole point of this. So Don't forget to see me back here again next Tuesday for another Tuesday's Tips. I'm really enjoying these, and I'm getting a lot of great feedback from folks. So if you're liking these, it's benefiting you, drop me a comment. Let me know. If you have a specific question about editing or something like that, drop that in the comments as well. I'm very happy to do purpose-driven tutorials based on what you want to see. We're getting to that point where I'm going to start getting into local edits, and then we're going to be kind of wrapped up with Lightroom, and I'm going to be talking about some very specific situations after that. So keep that in mind. Let me know. Give me a direction. Where do you want to see this channel go? And until next week, happy shooting, happy editing, and thanks for joining me. Take care.